Hello and welcome to Hearing Your Future, the Coding Your Future podcast. My name is Duncan, I'm your host, and I'm on a mission to help you design, build, test and code your future in computing. In this podcast we'll talk to current and former students of computer science to find out more about their journey from student to professional. What's their story? How are they coding their future? What obstacles have they faced and how did they overcome them? Finally, we ask our guests what advice they'd offer their former selves and fellow students and where are they headed next. My guest this week is an engineer. He spent more than 50 years using and subsequently designing the microprocessors that drive our increasingly digital lives. His career took off in the 1980s at Acorn Computers, where he worked on the BBC Micro and the first ARM processor, the ARM1, which he designed with his colleague Sophie Wilson. These contributed to the development and commercialization of the influential Reduced Instruction Set Computer, RISC, architecture. Overlooked by many semiconductor manufacturers at the time, RISC provided a simpler way to design and build integrated circuits that have since become widespread. His work continues today with the latest neuromorphic many-core supercomputers in the Spinnaker project, which are helping neuroscientists working on the human brain and e-brain projects to test new hypotheses about how brains actually work. As of 2023, the result of his and Sophie Wilson's work and many others can be found in more than 250 billion chips, from the tiniest sensors in the Internet of Things to our smartphones and from our cars to our data centers. Our future is built on these small square centimeters of heavily engineered silicon. Welcome, Steve, to Hearing Your Future. Welcome, Steve. Thank you for coming on the show. Could you just, before we start, could you introduce yourself and say who you are?
Hello, I'm Steve Furber. Until a few days ago, I was ICL Professor of Computer Engineering in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Manchester. But I retired a few days ago, so I'm now Professor Emeritus.
Professor Emeritus. And we can't possibly cover the whole of your career in a short interview like this. So we're having a Festschrift on the 12th of January. So I'm gonna point people to that and put that in the show notes. But instead of talking about the whole of your career, I'd like to focus on key parts of your career. So key decisions you've made in your education early on and your career, significant challenges you faced and how you overcame them. And then to talk about two key projects, one from your early career, BBC Micro, and then one from your later career, which is Spinnaker and its successors.
Okay.
So we have to go right back to the beginning. So I always ask students, so as the audience is mostly computer science students, I also ask them why they studied computer science, but you didn't study computer science initially. You studied mathematics as a student at Manchester Grammar School, just down the road here in Fallowfield. What was it that made you think that you wanted to spend 3 or 4 years of your life studying mathematics as an undergraduate?
I've always had an affinity for mathematics. If you go through my old school reports, they generally improve as I drop other subjects and focus in on the mathematics. Maths is in fact the only sport I've played for my country. So I was on the British team at the International Mathematical Olympiad in Hungary in 1970. So it was very natural for me to stick with mathematics when it came to choosing a university course.
I guess you must have had some good maths teachers at Manchester Grammar who sort of encouraged and inspired you to do things like go to Olympiads and the like.
Yes, I mean, MGS entered all the mathematicians in the National Mathematics Contest, which was, if you like, the first selection process for the British team. Yes, obviously we had experienced teachers who were very used to teaching people who were good at maths. I appreciated my time at MGS greatly.
Yeah, okay, good. And then, so you graduated in what year, 1970?
74.
74. So you graduated in 1974 from the University of Cambridge with was it a BA or an M Math, or was it a bachelor's or a master's degree?
They called it was a BA.
BA, okay. And then so you could have. That's obviously an important decision point in your life. Is you decided to stay on and do a PhD. What was it that made you stay to do postgraduate study?
Well, in the first instance, I stayed on to do the 1 year Part 3 maths course, which was a single postgraduate year, which at that time did not earn you any specific qualification. But 35 years later, the University of Cambridge decided that Part 3 maths was worth a master's after all, and I went back in 2010 to receive my M Math for that Part 3 year, which was 74 to 75. But in the course of that, I'd always lent towards the applied side of maths. And in my Part 3 work, I did a project with Sir James Lighthill, who was a well-known character. In fact, his name is around the university. If you look at the right building, his name is on one of them. But at that time, he was, I think, Lucasian professor at Cambridge, and he got very interested in studying the application of mathematics in biology, and in particular in flight. And my Part 3 project was with him on the intermittent flight of birds, which is why particularly small birds, when they're flying long distances, flap their wings for a bit and then fold them up and fly as projectiles before flapping them a bit more. And my Part 3 project was to try and understand the energetics of that style of flying and why it's a good thing for the birds to do. So through that, I got to know a bit more about the kind of work that was going on in the more theoretical end of aerodynamics in the engineering department. And I had a long interest in flying. I flew model aeroplanes as a boy and somewhat later in life. And so the idea of going and doing a PhD related to flying was very attractive. Now, my supervisor, who was Professor Sean Fowkes Williams, he had regularly offered a course in Part 3 maths, but he didn't actually offer it the year I took it, but I knew about it from previous years.
Right.
And that was clearly in an area that was going to be interesting. So I went to talk to him about a PhD and was accepted.
Right. So that was something in 1980, or was it 1979 or 1980? It says 1980 on there.
No, I started the PhD in 75. So the basic PhD period was 75 to 78.
Okay.
And then I had a research fellowship at Emmanuel, which was effectively a continuation of the PhD. I was Rolls-Royce Research Fellow at Emmanuel College.
Kind of like a postdoc, I guess.
78 to 81. Well, a research fellowship is similar to research fellowships that you can get from EPSRC or from the Royal Academy of Engineering. But in Cambridge, the colleges offer research fellowships, and these are effectively postdoc research positions. They're paid. They come with a salary, and they also are fellowships of the college. So you sit on the governing body of the college as a research fellow.
Right. Okay. So your PhD was on the title is the Weisfo. I'm not sure if is it Weisfo. Have I said that right?
Well, I've always pronounced it Weisfo.
Weisfo. Okay. Principal exploitable in turbo machines. So when I read that initially, I thought that sounded like something purely mathematical and fluid mechanics. But looking at it in a bit more depth, it looks like there was. You mentioned the biologically inspired work of looking at how birds fly and how insects fly. But it looks like there was actually experimental applied stuff in that PhD. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So Torkel Weisfo was a professor of biology at Cambridge at the time, and he studied in detail the way different sorts of animals fly. And he'd observed that one particularly small insect had an unusual flying motion, where instead of just flapping its wings back and forward, it appeared to clap them together at least at one end of the motion. And Lighthill had picked up on this and done a mathematical analysis and showed that by clapping its wings together, or more particularly by peeling them apart, this generated airflow around the wings that got the wings generating lift quicker than if they just moved forward in free air. So that was the vice-faux principle. And what my PhD was involved in doing was seeing whether one could create a similar effect in the compression stages of a jet engine. In a jet engine, you have alternating rows of blades, rotors and stators, where, as the name suggests, the rotors rotate and the stators don't. They're fixed. And you have multiple rows of each interleaved. And my PhD was looking at the interaction. If you put the rotors very close to the stators to increase the interaction, which was traditionally thought of as a bad thing, but could you exploit this vice-faux principle to actually make it a good thing, and get those blades to work more efficiently in some way by making them interact rather than what was usually done, which was trying to minimize the interaction.
So I suppose part of the PhD was sort of proof of concept that this would actually work in practice, of actually building a model and then modeling it mathematically as well.
Yes, the core of the PhD was a mathematical model, which was very much a development of Lighthill's model of the insect interaction, but it was obviously physically different and therefore requires slightly different modeling. But that was backed up by doing some experiments at the Whittle lab in Cambridge, which is the lab that was set up, I think, with support from Rolls-Royce to do research into jet engines,
like an engineering lab with, a proper with hardware and not a. I'm thinking like not a computational lab, not a computer.
No. This is a lab full of heavy equipment.
Yes.
And
yeah.
In my particular case, the first bit of equipment I used ran blades, so rows of rotors and stator blades, just a single row of each, but in a closed circuit water system. So it's using water as the medium rather than air. And that's a way of I think of getting a more appropriate Reynolds number at small scale and at low cost.
Right.
If you want to do things in air, at jet engine scale, it's quite expensive because you have to run things at sort of close to the speed of sound and so on to get realistic operation. Whereas in water, you can do it on a much smaller scale and much cheaper.
Right. Okay. So, what were the main challenges you faced in your PhD, and how did you overcome them?
I think doing the maths was, relatively straightforward. That was what I did, and using mathematics to analyze fluid flows is a very well developed field of research. There are very interesting analogies between the way a rather purist model of fluids works and complex number theory in the complex plane. Okay, and this has been used for probably 100 years to compute efficient aerofoil shapes and so on. It is only an approximation because it's assuming the fluid is inviscid, which real fluids are not, but at least it's a good start. So the mathematics, although not trivial, was what I was comfortable with. I think my biggest challenge doing a PhD was actually being confident that what I was doing was at all important or relevant or would go anywhere, right? So I could do the mechanics of the PhD, but I wasn't very good on the context, and my supervisor encouraged me to attend an annual British mathematical colloquium and I think present my work there, and that was quite forbidding for me at that stage. I didn't sort of feel I'd really got my feet on the ground. I didn't really know enough about what was going on in my area of research to really be able to place myself confidently at that stage. So I think my biggest challenge was probably confidence.
How I mean, as somebody who's now supervised countless PhD students. Well, not countless, but how many PhD students? Probably.
As a mathematician, I cannot allow you to use the word countless in that context. They are definitely countable.
Countable, okay.
It's just over 30 PhD.
Over 30, okay. But so you must have seen all sorts of supervised all sorts of PhD students and come across very similar problems of that.
Yes. Yes.
Putting their work in context, whether it's publishing in a journal or going to a conference or whatever it might be.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's probably the most common sort of psychological challenge that PhD students face is going from, effectively doing what they're told in class, reproducing it in an exam as an undergraduate, to basically going out and working on their own with hopefully some support and mentorship from their PhD supervisor, and having any idea as to whether what they're doing is worth doing.
Yeah, okay.
And whether they can move it forward far enough in the very limited time allowed for a UK PhD.
So for you personally, how did you develop that sort of confidence or self-efficacy, or I don't know quite what to call it? How did you do it in your particular context? Was it just jumping in and just doing it?
I don't think I really did develop the confidence at that stage, even with the research fellowship. I think I was still a bit unsure about my position in the world of fluid dynamics. And that was probably one of the reasons why, at the end of my research fellowship, I decided to move into industry with Acorn.
Right. Okay. So that gets us from maths to computing. And I think that you had some exposure to computing in the PhD, I guess. So like many people of my generation, the BBC Micro, which you and Sophie Wilson designed, was my introduction to computing. So what was your kind of BBC Micro equivalent? What was your first exposure to kind of computing that sparked an interest?
Well, interestingly, I had some exposure to computing at school. So in my last year or so at MGS, one of the teachers took computing classes, and we learnt, I think it must have been Fortran at the time.
On what kind of hardware? What kind of?
Well, we used a computer at Imperial College in London, as I recall, if I'm remembering this right. It is quite a long time ago. And the way we fed this computer was we had pre-punched 80-column cards. Okay, now in those days, 80-column cards were very standard ways of feeding data into computers. But we didn't even have a card punch. So we had these pre-punched cards, and they only pre-punched every other column. So effectively, there were 40 columns. And you could push the little squares out of these cards, with a pencil or a sharp instrument, to enter your program into this card. And of course, a typical program would be a few tens of these cards, all carefully, manually punched out. And then they would be posted to Imperial. And 2 weeks later, a computer line printer output would come back, saying syntax error on line 3 or something.
Right. Yeah.
You learnt how to code carefully this way. The debug cycle was very long. And I don't remember anything about the programs that I wrote. But that was my introduction. And then in my maths course, I think in our second year, we had some exposure to computers. The maths department had some modular 1 computers, which probably nobody's ever heard of. I do remember these used storage oscilloscope tubes as their output medium. And these were storage tubes, so they would write on the screen, and that would stay visible until you needed to start again, and then you'd flash erase the whole screen. It's a bit like flash memory as a screen, and you get output from that. But the real start of my computing came probably in 77, 78. As I've said, I was interested in aviation. I joined the University Glider Club in my second year, but it took too much time for too little flying. So I'd begun to think about flight simulators. And then I heard about a bunch of students who were starting a university society called the Cambridge University Processor Group. Okay, and I thought, okay, well, if these people think they can build computers, maybe that's how I build a flight simulator. So I joined the processor group and started ordering microchips from California, which was extremely scary in those days, ordering by credit card from the far side of the world, and hand building computers.
Right. And but then you were using them in your PhD as logging data, or is this a separate?
Yes. No, the computers sort of blended with my PhD. I used them for data logging from some of the experiments I did, particularly later on, but I also used the computer I hand built to write my PhD thesis. Okay, so in those days, if you wanted to write a PhD thesis on a computer, first you had to hand make the computer. And then you had to write a suitable text editor for writing a thesis on. And then you had to print it off. And because my thesis was mathematical, I needed both Roman and Greek characters.
Right.
But the university had a twin-track daisy wheel printer. Who remembers daisy wheel printers? But the idea of a daisy wheel printer was it had a thing called a daisy wheel, which had a number of petals where each petal had a character on, and this wheel ran round at high speed, and then a solenoid banged at the right moment to print the character on the paper. And this twin daisy wheel had two of these, one with Roman alphabet and one with Greek. And my PhD thesis was printed on a continuous roll of paper about 200 feet long.
All right, wow. So it wasn't, I mean, the traditional approach then might have been, I guess, to you write it down on paper and then give it to somebody to type up. I guess that would other people would have done.
That was normal at the time. Yes, your thesis would be handwritten, and you'd find a secretary who would translate your handwritten writing and type it up on paper.
But you built your own machine to type to print your
Well, in fact, I built my own machine, which I entered my thesis into. This text editor was a little bit fragile. For instance, it didn't have any proper detection for buffer overrun, so changing too much at once was a bad idea. But I then transferred the text file onto a university computer, which was a computer automation LSI-4, using 8-inch floppy disks.
Right.
I think I still have the 8-inch floppy disks with my thesis on. I don't think I know where I would go to read one of these.
Well, yeah.
And yes, and then the LSI-4 allowed me to transfer it to floppy, which could then be taken along to print on this daisy wheel printer. Okay,
good. So we've that's where the computing comes from then. So you mentioned Acorn computers. There's something followed on from your fellowship. And last year, in 2022, yourself, Sophie Wilson, John Hennessy, David Patterson were awarded the Charles Stark Draper Prize from the National Academy of Engineering in the United States for contributions to the invention, development, and implementation of the reduced instruction set computer, RISC chips. So can you describe where and how that architecture came about and what motivated it? So perhaps we've perhaps fast forwarded a little bit to after your PhD, you're working at Acorn Computers.
Yes. So the simplified story here is that RISC was created, invented, expounded by John Hennessy and David Patterson in the USA, and Sophie and I used that concept in the ARM processor, which turned RISC into a very big thing at Acorn. This is one of these rare occasions where some academic research in the US gets commercialized in the UK rather than the other way around, which is much more common. But the Acorn had developed the BBC Micro, which had succeeded way beyond anybody's expectations. and was beginning to think about what it could do to follow on, to build on that success. And at that time, the BBC Micro used an 8-bit microprocessor, the 6502, the same as the one used in the Apple II and the Commodore PET and a whole lot of other stuff. But the world was beginning to transition to 16-bit microprocessors. And if you remember the BBC Micro well enough, you'll know that it had the capability of having a second processor plugged onto it. And we prototyped a whole lot of 16-bit systems using the second processor capability. It was very easy to build a second processor with a random microprocessor for the BBC Micro. And we didn't like any of them. And the reason we didn't like them, there were two technical reasons, one of which was their real-time performance, in other words, their ability to handle interrupts, for example, for managing disk transfers, in every case was worse than the 6502.
Right.
And the reason for this was because they had complex instructions which were typically not interruptible. So I remember the National Semiconductor 32016 had a memory divide instruction which took 360 clock cycles to complete. And the clock was 6 megahertz, so that's 60 microseconds. Well, a single density floppy at the time produced a byte of data every 64 microseconds, double density every 32. So you couldn't handle double density floppies without external hardware support. So that was one thing we didn't like, the real-time response. And the second thing was we'd come to the firm view that the thing that was the principal determinant of computer performance was the processor's ability to use memory bandwidth.
Right.
And the memory was the most expensive component in these computers.
From the memory on the Model A BBC Micro, there was, I think it was 16 kilobytes, wasn't it? Is that right?
The Model A was 16, but mainly we sold Model Bs, which had 32 kilobytes of RAM. And we worked that memory very hard. In fact, the BBC Micro was pushing the memory. We got the first memories in the country capable of running at 4 mega accesses a second. Now, the 16-bit processors I'm complaining about couldn't even keep up with their memories. So as a user, you paid for this expensive memory and then the processor wasn't using it fully.
Right.
And this frustrated us because we couldn't see why this should be the case. And then we heard about the RISC research, particularly from Berkeley, but also at Stanford. So the Berkeley work was led by David Patterson and the Stanford work by John Hennessy. And they used a postgrad class to develop a novel style of processor in a year. Whereas we were talking to the big companies such as NatSemi, which were on the sort of 8th revision of the 32016, and they still haven't got the bugs out years later. And we thought, well, if this postgrad class can design a working processor, then maybe we can. And that is what kicked Sophie in the first instance. And then I got drawn into thinking about designing a RISC architecture. Sophie had a lot of experience writing the basic interpreter for the B band, the Atom, and a very good understanding of what high-level language is needed. And so combining that with these new RISC ideas from California, Sophie did the instruction set architecture, I did the microarchitecture, and we had a team of chip designers who took the microarchitecture and mapped it onto silicon.
Right. Okay.
And that's how the ARM emerged. And it was 18 months from starting to first chip. On April the 26th, 1985. That's a date imprinted in my memory, you can tell. The first chip worked, and it did everything we expected. It was 25 times faster than the BBC Micro, simply because we knew what the memory bandwidth was, and we could design it to have 25 times the memory bandwidth, right? It was...
And that was then used in successors to the BBC Micro, which were...
Yes.
Acorn was selling.
In fact, because the ARM was designed as one chip in a 4-chip set, it wasn't until 1987 that the first product was launched, and that was by then we had the second ARM, the ARM 2. So the first volume product was ARM2 based. We did sell second processors for the BBC Micro based on ARM1, but they were really development engines rather than fully fledged products.
Right. Okay. So, last Friday, so we had a small gathering to celebrate your retirement last Friday, and you mentioned the estimate, the number of units that Acorn estimated that they might sell of these BBC Micros. What was their estimate? And
so
how
we're going back to the BBC Micro.
Yes. Yeah.
Which sort of predates the ARM. Yes, the BBC was reasonably confident that on the back of the series of computer programs they wished to produce, based on the BBC Micro, that Acorn could expect to sell 12,000 units of the BBC Micro, which for Acorn was a reasonable number, quite an attractive number. And of course, that turned out to be a gross underestimate. In the end, I think 1.5 million BBC Micros were sold.
Yeah. So why do you think that estimate was so far out? Was it partly tied up with the literacy project that was computer literacy project the BBC were running, was sort of generating demand for these machines, or was it prior to that?
I don't think it was just that. There's no doubt that the BBC badge helps the wider public be confident in the product, whether rightly or wrongly, because it was still designed and built by Acorn, but it carried the BBC logo. But I think nobody anticipated the rate at which the wider public would be interested in owning computers. Okay, it was not that many years earlier that I think one of the chief executives at IBM had said, 6 computers would be enough for the world forever, or something like that. Nobody really anticipated that when you got the right functionality and price point, that everybody would want one in their homes. That came as a big surprise. So it was a very exciting time because things really took off. And of course, it wasn't just the BBC Micro that enjoyed this explosion in demand. I mean, the person we saw as our main competitor was Clive Sinclair, just down the road in Cambridge. and of course, his company also enjoyed huge success with the ZX81 and Spectrum computers.
Yeah. So that RISC architecture from Acorn is now widely used. So in 2021, they passed the 200 billion milestone, 200 billion ARM designed chips on the planet, and now 250 billion, this year, meaning that there are about 30 ARM chips for every person currently alive on the planet. At the time you were working on it, I mean, you could see obviously there was this excitement about people buying these BBC Micros, for example, but did you have any sense for how influential the architecture would become at that point?
No. Firstly, when we started designing the ARM, having studied the RISC papers and thought about the problem they were trying to solve, and RISC, by the way, is basically a drive for simplicity. The ethos behind RISC is, if you like, the antithesis to the common thinking of that time in the early 80s, which was went under the heading of closing the semantic gap between the instruction set architecture and a high-level language. RISC was actually saying, no, don't do that. Keep the processor as simple and efficient as possible and use the compiler to close the semantic gap.
Right.
So RISC was about keeping the processor simple, which is why it was possible for Acorn, with no processor design experience. In fact, at the time, no full custom chip design experience really worth speaking of, to build a competitive processor. But at the time, we thought this was, if you thought about it, it was such an obvious idea that everybody would do it, right? And we just get trampled underfoot by the big players who have far more resource to do it with. And so ARM ultimately would probably not go anywhere, but in the process of designing it, we'd learn a lot, and that would position us, put us in a better place for choosing which of the commercial processors to buy in. Now, much to our surprise, the big companies were all stuck on the sort of complex instruction set approach derived from the mini computers of the 1970s, and they didn't buy the RISC story until very late in the 80s, by which time ARM was on a bit of a roll. But of course, the turning point for ARM was just after I left Acorn to come to Manchester. Apple came knocking on the door at Acorn, and they wanted to use ARM in their Newton product.
Right.
Again, most people have forgotten the Newton, but in those days, as today, Apple was a magic brand in the computing world.
Yeah.
And getting the Apple stamp of approval, setting up ARM Limited as a separate joint venture between Acorn and Apple, with input from VLSI Technology, who made the chips. That really got the ARM moving, and of course, some very clever management and technical work by the team under Robin Saxby built this new business model that made the company work financially, which companies have to do, right? It's
yeah. So rather than manufacturing the chips themselves, it was this licensing model
yes,
like that came from Robin Saxby.
That's right. In my last couple of years at Acorn, I'd spent a fair bit of time thinking about, what would happen if we moved the ARM activity out of the company, and tried to license the architecture and take royalties. But none of the business models worked. And the reason is that royalties are not good for cash flow. Royalties come late and little, and it's a long time for them to build up. And Saxby looked at this model, and he added a different component to it, which was effectively a join the club upfront fee. So you pay a chunk of money to get an ARM license, and then downstream, when you want ARM in your product, you pay royalties.
Right. Okay.
The upfront money is of course excellent for cash flow, and that made the company work.
And helps you fund some of that design, I suppose. That because designing these chips is time consuming and expensive and requires a lot of expertise, and not always appreciated from the outside, I guess, is that how much work goes into designing these things.
No, I mean, designing a processor, well, designing any kind of chip today is a multi-hundred man-year task.
Yeah.
The first ARM processor was much less than that, because it was very simple and because chips were smaller than in transistor count. But
okay, so moving on from Acorn then. So we should say, so Acorn, the acronym ARM stands for, is it Advanced RISC Machines, or is it Acorn RISC Machines?
It's been both. Originally, it was the Acorn RISC Machine. That's where ARM comes from.
Right.
And then when that activity was spun out into this joint venture with Apple, they changed the Acorn bits to Advanced, so it became Advanced RISC Machine. And then a few years later, they just dropped the expansion altogether, and it's just ARM.
Yeah. Okay.
And initially it was capital A, capital R, capital M, and now it's all lowercase.
So you spent 10 years at Apple from about 1980. A bit less than 10 years, I suppose.
Yeah, I joined the staff in October 81 at the end of my research fellowship. And this is Acorn we're talking about.
Yeah, sorry.
Although I had been working with them for a couple of years before. And effectively I'd been working with them. I'd been giving them designs in exchange for components to allow me to build computers to use in my research and so on. So I'd been involved in Acorn since they were formed as CPU Limited in about 77, 78.
Right.
Yeah.
So in 1990, you mentioned in August of 1990, you made the decision to move back to Manchester. You took the ICL chair, which you've held for 33 years. What made you, so that's an interesting decision. What made you decide to, move out of doing commercial R&D and come back to academia?
So yes, that's a very good question, and I think the answer is that the early years at Acorn were very exciting, with the development of the BBC Micro and the first ARM chips, and the growth in the market, and generally things very much on an upward trend. But then, roughly when we got the first ARM chips, Acorn effectively went bust, and was rescued by Olivetti. And then from the mid-80s onwards, it was increasingly run on a financial basis rather than a sort of rapid technology development slope. It became a financially managed company. And for me, that meant doing interesting things was getting harder and harder.
Yeah.
And I couldn't see where it was going. And of course, I had no idea that a month after I left, Apple would come knocking. That might have influenced my decision. It's one can't go back and try again.
Yeah.
And so the company became very flat, and essentially its business was defined by however much the government decided to spend on education computers that year. And it was increasingly difficult to fund the kind of resource required to maintain the ARM processor development within that constrained budget. So I began to think about what my alternatives were, and I felt, after my 9 years at Acorn, that I'd become sufficiently established in the computing business that I could probably make a go of academic research in that area. So I'd been muttering about possibly going back to academia. I wrote a book while I was at Acorn.
The VLSI.
The VLSI Risk Architecture and Organization, yes, which was published at a very high price, so it didn't sell very many. But it's still a kind of milestone book, and I think it's part of my objective in writing that book was, of course, as working in industry, I didn't publish many papers, so I thought if I wrote a book that would establish some academic respectability.
Yeah, in doing some research for this, it was much easier to find out about your career post 1990 than that period 80 to 90, because, as you say, there wasn't that. It's not much of it's documented, right? It's not in the same way as you can look at papers and see when things happened. It's not so easy to see what the timeline was in Acorn.
Yes, and partly that's because industry, isn't that interested in publishing. We did publish some papers in the 80s, but not many. But also, of course, the World Wide Web hadn't started then.
Yeah.
I mean, the internet, of course, has existed since the 60s. And as Acorn, we were already making extensive use of email and so on internally in the 80s. But there wasn't the World Wide Web, and so there wasn't the sort of online recording of almost everything that happened.
Yeah.
In any case, companies would probably keep quite a lot of their information off the web for confidentiality reasons.
Yeah. Go on, sorry.
Once you're in a university, then the tendency is to do everything out in the open. That's
very different culture.
Yes.
So in setting up your lab, your research group and your team when you arrived in Manchester, what were the main obstacles you faced as a new academic building a research lab? What were those obstacles early on, and how did you overcome them at the beginning?
Well, I was fortunate in that in my last few years at Acorn, I'd been involved in a European initiative called the Open Microprocessor Systems Initiative. I think it was originally OMI, the Open Microprocessor Initiative, which was a European initiative to fund significant research activity in the microprocessor space. And I got a project under development at Acorn. When I moved to Manchester, Acorn was happy for me to move a chunk of that project with me. So effectively, I brought some initial funding with me.
And some people as well, some staff, or
no, I didn't bring any staff from Acorn. When I was appointed to the ICL chair, I was given a lectureship to fill, and that was filled pretty early on by Jim Garside.
Oh, right, okay. Right.
Who was a great acquisition for the group. Jim's a real engineer and has sort of provided the engineering underpinnings of a lot of what we've done since. So I was given a lectureship, but I didn't bring people with me. No, I brought funding with me, which is for a new academic often the most difficult thing to secure.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
So and with that, I was able to recruit a few people, and my first PhD student was Nigel Paver, who was an Arm fellow for quite a long time at Austin in Texas, and now runs a Samsung development activity in Austin, Texas.
Right.
So he's gone on to great success in the chip design business. His career involved periods at Intel as well as Arm, and now Samsung. And I recruited people, and the first thing you've got to do coming into academia is decide on your research direction. Okay. And I had a number of ideas in my head coming from Acorn. I presented a paper at VLSI 89, which I think was in Munich. And while I was there, I heard a talk on asynchronous design from a guy from an Australian university. And that had got me interested. So the first direction of research I took at Manchester was looking at implementing the ARM in asynchronous technology, which means without a clock.
Yeah.
So that all the internal activities self-timed. And that direction of research actually carried us through the 90s.
And up to the present day, a sort of follow on from the asynchronous stuff was the more recently the Spinnaker project, which you've led part of this multi-billion-pound EU-funded human brain project. So Spinnaker, in some ways, is a sort of, I suppose, can we call it a descendant or a sort of it is part of this sort of arc of your career. So that this is a neuromorphic computer, a neuromorphic processor rather, which passed the milestone of having 1 million cores in 2018. So can you tell us a little bit about the Spinnaker project that follows on from this, and Spinnaker 2 and 3?
Yeah, right. How long have you got?
Well,
so the origins of Spinnaker are that by the end of the 90s, we basically shown that we could build pretty much anything you want in asynchronous logic.
Yeah.
The last Amulet 3 was effectively a system on chip, although it was only half the chip. But and that was developed for a commercial application, but sadly the commercial collaborator went out of business before the chip got applied. So, but it was clear by the end of the 90s that processor design was moving from sort of manual hardcore, here's a physical implementation of the processor you can go and use, to synthesizable stuff. And the synthesis tools for asynchronous logic were nowhere near as developed as those for clock logic. So we kind of had to start again, and we had some work going on synthesis tools in the form of Balsa, which was led by Doug Edwards in the group. But it was going to take a long time to compete. And industry acceptance of asynchronous design was very slow at the time. So I began to think it was time for a change of direction. I'd been in the processor design business for more than 20 years. Processors were 1,000 times faster, but they still struggled to do things that we humans find quite easy. And towards the end of the 90s, I got a grant from EPSRC called a ROPA grant, Realizing Our Potential Award. And this required you to go off in a new direction. It was based on having industrial support, but you had to choose a new direction. So I thought, I've always been interested in associative memories. I use them in processor caches and so on. But they're all very brittle. You give them exactly the right input, they give you exactly the right output. You give them the slightly wrong input, they give you rubbish.
Yeah.
So for this ROPA award, we started investigating inexact associative memories. And I found that every way we looked at that problem, we were reinventing neural networks. And so that influenced me to sort of think, well, maybe there's things the brain can do that we can't do with computers at all easily. I like associative memories, but they all seem to look like neural networks. So maybe we should look at neural networks. And that really was the thing that began pointing me in the direction of the Spinnaker project. And
Right.
we spent several years bringing ideas together. I was head of department, you don't recall because I don't think you were here then, but
And I can remember you serving as head of department. So I think it was German PhD, but yeah.
That was 2001 to 4. I was head right up to the merger with you. And after that, I got the usual 1 year post-headship rehabilitation sabbatical. And I spent a couple of months of that at Sun Labs in Menlo Park in California.
Right.
Looking at some of their supercomputer plans that they were developing at the time, and doing some asynchronous logic with the group there that was very active in async design. And while looking at these supercomputers, the sort of concepts that I wanted to build into this neural network computer began to gel. And it was at that point that I realized that there was actually a very strong argument, particularly for a research platform, for using a general purpose processor as the engine to model neurons and synapses rather than dedicated hardware, which was more commonly used.
Yeah.
So that's really when the concepts behind Spinnaker came together in 2004-5. And then we got good funding from EPSRC to get this project going. And that led us into collaborations with Heidelberg in the European project. And that positioned us to join the HBP. We actually got something to offer to the HBP when that started in 2013.
And finished this year, I think. So
finished
10 years later in 20.
Same day. It finished the day I retired, yes. And that's not really a coincidence. I wanted to see the HBP out, which is why I've carried on beyond the age of 70, which is rather old for academic retirement. Typically.
So there's two. It's difficult to summarize Spinnaker as the big project in a short interview like this, but there's two things that are interesting. So there's what has Spinnaker helped scientists learn about the brain, because you're trying to help biologists and neuroscientists understand how the brain works by modeling some of it. And then the other part of that is then what have we learned from building? So there's a scientific challenge of trying to help scientists, and then there's the engineering challenge of what have we learned from building neuromorphic computers like Spinnaker and its successors. So can we start with the brain stuff first? What has Spinnaker helped? How has that helped scientists' understanding of how brains work?
Well, it would be false to claim that Spinnaker has transformed our understanding of the brain. Okay, its contributions to brain science are thus far more modest than that.
Yeah.
But it has provided a platform for testing hypotheses and novel learning algorithms that have come out of various other groups in the HBP have been implemented on Spinnaker and explored to see how effective they are, how biologically plausible they are, and to what extent they may or may not be explaining things that are going on in the brain. Because of course, the way the brain works as an information processor is still a mystery to science. We know a lot about the bits from which it's constructed and how they operate, but we still really don't know how information is represented or processed in the brain. And Spinnaker has allowed various hypotheses to be tested and models to be built. So there was a kind of friendly competition in the HBP between a supercomputer center at Jülich and Spinnaker at Manchester and the GPU system at Sussex.
Jülich is
Jülich is the German supercomputer center.
Right. Okay.
Jülich is a town in Germany, but it's the Forschungszentrum. So it is the major German supercomputer center in northwest Germany, and they developed a model of an area of cortex, and they run this on their supercomputers, and we've run it on Spinnaker, and it's been run on GPU systems. And Spinnaker was the first machine to achieve real-time, biological real-time performance on this model.
Yeah.
And the model reproduces measured average spiking rates in layers. It allows us to say, well, yes, this appears to be, to reproduce quite a lot of the things we can measure about cortical activity. It has a circuit that we can write down. It's relatively simple to write down what the neural circuit is here. We still don't understand what it's doing or how it does it. But at least we have a model that's fairly easy to interrogate and test hypotheses on. And as I say, Spinnaker was the first to achieve biological real time, despite being really quite old technology now, and the HPC and GPU systems being much more modern technology. So it kind of suggests that the architecture that we conceived has advantages if it can enable an old technology to compete with much newer technologies.
Yeah. Are there any other sort of engineering? What do we learn from building these systems? Regardless of what they get used for, it's a challenge just building.
Oh yes. I mean, our original concept was to put 1 million ARM cores into a machine for real-time brain modeling. Okay, and 1 million is a big number. Otherwise it's a random number, but it's just a big target, and it's about the limit of what you can sensibly think you're going to do on an academic budget. So we had to design scalability in from the outset. That was the driving function. And building a machine that big requires you to address a whole lot of engineering issues. One of which is, of course, every component in that machine they'll never all work at the same time, right?
Yeah.
There will be failures, and therefore you have to design a high degree of fault tolerance into both the hardware and the software that runs on it.
Yeah.
And we've done that very successfully. There are things we didn't anticipate. The 1 million core Spinnaker machine has around 10 square meters of active silicon area. Okay, so you think of microchips as being about 1 centimeter square. This is the full machine has the equivalent of about 3 meters by 3 meters of active silicon.
It's big.
So it's a pretty good radiation detector.
Right.
and sitting there in the concrete room in the Kilburn building, we can still detect what are called single event upsets when a radiation particle knocks over a bit of memory in the machine.
Oh, right. Okay. This is not something you anticipated, I suppose.
We kind of anticipated it, but we anticipated it in the wrong place. And we only found it in the right place because I was asked a question by a professor from Germany who was thinking about these things. We expected most of the memory on Spinnaker is in these separate DRAM chips, which are in the package, but they're standard chips. And we expected some memory faults in those chips, but we've never seen one. What we didn't expect was faults in the on-chip memory on the Spinnaker chip itself.
Right.
And we see those and we can measure them, and on the full machine we get 2 or 3 an hour. So it's quite significant, and the importance of that is it was immediately fed forward into the design of Spinnaker 2. So Spinnaker 2 has fully error correcting memory all over the chip now.
Right. As a result of that, so Spinnaker 2 is finished now, or is that still under construction?
Spinnaker 2 has been co-developed within the Human Brain Project with TU Dresden, who have a very effective silicon backend team. And yes, it's been designed and we now have full silicon. So we have Spinnaker 2 chips. Currently, we just have individual chips, but Dresden is now putting together 48 node boards, which are the same kind of density as the boards in the Spinnaker 1 machine. And they will be putting together a 5 million core Spinnaker machine in Dresden over the next year or so. And Spinnaker 2 is very much an evolution of Spinnaker 1. It's conceptually very similar. It incorporates quite a lot of lessons we've learned from Spinnaker 1, such as the importance of high quality random number sources. And so it has hardware to do that, and hardware to compute sort of exponentials and logarithms.
Right.
And it also has high performance matrix vector multipliers for conventional artificial networks, as well as support for spiking networks.
And then is the plans for a Spinnaker 3, is this then the same conceptually, or is it a shift away from Spinnaker 1 and 2?
Spinnaker 3 is still at the conceptual stage, I would say.
Okay. Right.
But Dresden has spun out a company called Spin Cloud Systems GmbH to commercialize Spinnaker 2. And the expectation is that if that commercialization starts moving, they'll want a Spinnaker 3 to follow on.
Right. Okay. Good. Okay. So I think we've covered there was a question about biggest challenges in Spinnaker. I think we've covered most of that, perhaps a little superficially, but I think I'll move on. So there's some standard questions I ask all the students who come on this program. So one of them is, I very much doubt you want to be the next Vice Chancellor, but the University of Manchester, where you've worked for 33 years, is looking for a new Vice Chancellor next year. And so I asked students, you've obviously taught lots of students, undergraduates, master's students and PhD students. So if you were to have the job of Vice Chancellor, what would you do to improve the teaching and learning of computer science, specifically at Manchester, but perhaps in higher education generally as well?
Okay, so my answer to this is going to sound a little bit indirect if you're an undergraduate, because it's not really directly about what they see or feel at all. But in my time at the university, and particularly since the merger, there has been a tendency to centralize resources. So we've seen support staff move out of the department and into the School of Engineering and into faculty and into the centre. And I believe this is to the detriment of everything that we do. Okay, yeah. So I've been arguing for some time that what you need are good support staff in the coalface, close to the academics. I mean, an example is...
And close to the students as well.
Well, yes, of course. An example, a clear example is IT services. Now, if we have a problem with machines in the lab, it's very difficult to get the problem sorted in real time.
Yeah.
When I came to the university, we had IT management, IT services in the department, and if you had a problem with the lab, you went and knocked on their door and they came down and fixed it. Right. And now you have to submit a job and 3 weeks later somebody might do something.
Yeah.
And that's one example. I mean, you really need good IT support in the labs. Now we still do have some very good people around in the labs.
Yes.
But they don't cover everything.
So it's an organizational the way the organization works is really important. It has a big impact on student experience and their learning and what they get out of their time here.
Yes, I mean, the IT thing would affect students directly, but the other services, for example, research services, are much more anonymous and remote than they used to be.
Yeah.
And this means that a lot more academic time goes into handling the administration of their research, and the administration of all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
Than used to be the case. And I'm very much in favor of decentralized services and pushing support people. My rather crude model of university administration is that a good admin person close to the academics and the students sees it as their job to make things work, right?
Yeah.
Whereas any admin remote from the academics and the students sees it as their job to stop bad things from happening. Now, there's one very reliable way to stop bad things from happening, and that's to stop anything from happening, right? And that tends to be the mode that you sometimes see operating. It's become incredibly hard.
Yes.
To get administrative things done that used to be straightforward, or where the help used to be much closer to hand.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think as Vice Chancellor, that would be where I would start.
Good. All right. Well,
making academics' lives easier, so they've got more time for their teaching and their research, right?
yes.
And that would then improve, because there's no issue with academics wanting to provide students with excellent teaching and learning experience. The problem is the time they have available to do it.
Finite resource.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So one other thing. So we shan't be casting you away to a desert island with 8 tracks and a book, but we ask our guests to recommend one piece of music to our listeners and say why that one piece of music is important to them. So this is an opportunity for me to thank you. Before the pandemic, you played bass guitar in our prototype band. So thank you for doing that. And you still play bass now, I take it.
Yes, I play in a local church band. I've just we moved house earlier in this year to be closer to our grandchildren in retirement, but we've attached ourselves to a local Methodist church and been welcomed into the music group there. So
good. So what piece of music? And I'm sorry, I can only give you one piece of music. That's not very but
yeah, no, I don't. So everybody knows that I'm a sort of lifelong Moody Blues fan. I mean, I was exposed to the Moody Blues by a friend in the 60s, I think, before the first moon landing, and have simply loved their music ever since. And I've been to see them several times. As a band from the 60s, they're unusual in that they were still playing a lot of live concerts up to about 5 years ago. Now, I think too many of the original lineup have died for them to function, although the man who wrote, I think, quite a lot of the best of their songs, Justin Hayward, is still going strong. And so the piece of music I'm going to choose is a bit obscure. I mean, most people have come across Nights in White Satin, which is the most famous of the Moody Blues tunes, but I'm going to choose The Story in Your Eyes.
The Story in Your Eyes. Okay, good. We'll add that to the playlist, and I'm going to have a listen to that. And partly, why is that particular piece important?
Partly, I like that because although I play bass now, I was once in my undergraduate days a lead guitarist, not a very good one, I have to admit, but so I kind of love guitar, and I just think the guitar on that track is particularly nice, good, strong, whatever's the right word. I'm not quite sure. If anybody can work out what the lyrics are about, they better let me know. But like a lot of Moody Blues songs have lyrics which are a bit on the obscure side. But,
good.
But no, it's got a great guitar introduction and a couple of good guitar solos in the middle, and
right. Okay.
Generally sort of strong. Yeah.
Okay. And then the other thing is then, I don't know if you listen to podcasts much, but either a podcast or a radio show that you listen to that you recommend other people listen to.
Well, I mean, I don't listen to podcasts a lot, but I do have some that download onto my phone, and I haven't traveled so much in the last few years post-pandemic, but when I used to fly, I used to listen to podcasts on the plane quite a lot.
Yeah.
I think the best and the most diverse podcasts are the In Our Time podcasts,
right,
by Melvin Bragg. Now, I'm not going to point at a specific one.
No, that's okay.
I just think that series, it's so wide ranging and covers stuff in which I have a direct interest and stuff I've never heard anything about.
Yeah, from physics through to everything, history,
physics through to ancient civilizations. And I think Melvin Bragg does draw out good thoughts and insights from his guests in that. So that would be my choice there.
Good. Okay. And one film.
Right. So
you're not allowed to say BBC Micromen.
No, I don't think I would choose that anyway. I mean, it's a lovely little drama, but and largely almost true. But no, I was choosing here. I got so I think my second choice it's a film that I haven't seen around recently, but I loved it at the time, which was Those Magnificent Men in Their Flying Machines.
Right.
Again, I like aircraft, and that's got some great old aircraft, including some genuine, a 1912 Blackburn monoplane is flying in that, which is an original plane.
Yeah, yeah.
Actually, that's not my first choice. My first choice is 2001, The Space Odyssey.
Space Odyssey, right.
Um,
You would have seen that in the cinema for the first time. When did that film come out?
it was sometime in the 1960s.
Right. Yeah. With
And
the music, the combination of the music and the cinematography at the time was quite groundbreaking, wasn't it? We take it for granted now, but
it was absolutely staggering. I mean, of course, it's way before the time of CGI. So it was all done with models, but it was done right.
Yeah.
In a way that, I like Star Wars movies, right? But the little spacecraft, they fly like Second World War planes, right? Which you can only do in air, right? It's completely unrealistic as a dynamics of a space vehicle. Whereas 2001, they got everything right, including the sequence where the flight docks with the space station, right? Which takes the whole of the Blue Danube. Now, I know in reality it would take hours rather than tens of minutes, but at least they give it a decent time.
Yeah.
And of course, the Blue Danube isn't bad as an accompaniment either, right?
Yeah.
So I just think the way they handle that, and of course the opening sequence is historic, right? The apes having a battle, and then the bone going up in the air and turning into a space station.
Yeah. And still topical today with all the AI references in there as well, or AI themes in the film.
Oh well, of course, yes. I mean, HAL has not been superseded as illustrative of the ultimate threat.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, the stuff at the end gets a bit weird, but that's
yeah. Okay. Talking science fiction, so given a time machine, a colleague of ours in the physics department has invented a time machine that they assure me works. And if you could travel back in time to when you were a student at university in the 70s, what advice would you offer your former self and fellow students and students studying computer science now about making the most of their short time at university?
So I have a slightly tangential response to this. I mean, when I was at university studying maths, I was reasonably diligent as a student. The maths course was not that demanding in terms of time, as long as you concentrated and did the examples and so on. But one thing I did at Cambridge was I joined a university society, which was the 20th Century Christian Music Group. Again, this relates to my playing in church groups these days. And a lot of my leisure time, as it were, my non-work time at university was spent with 20th century practicing and playing not very well in concerts and so on. But most importantly, through that group, I met my wife.
Right.
They always said of 20th century, it wasn't a very good music group, but it was a great marriage bureau.
Yeah, I think when a lot of people look back on their university, it's those things that you remember. You'll forget the sweat of some of the study, but actually it's the social stuff, that relationships that last a lifetime, that are the thing that most people remember long after they've forgotten whatever it was they were studying at university, the actual, the specific details.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, my advice, well, I have some basic advice, which I give to anybody who's asking me about, if they're trying to take a decision. And that is the algorithm for choosing what you do. And my algorithm is, if you don't know what you want to do, then make the decision which maximizes the number of doors that stay open.
Yeah.
And for that reason, I would never advise against reading maths if you need an affinity for maths to make sense, but maths opens lots of doors, as would physics. Computer science is a bit narrower, but there's still a lot of opportunities emerging from computer science these days. Computers are everywhere, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So all of these things, and obviously you choose between them based on your interests and your motivation. So keep as many doors open as you can. Don't neglect your studies. Keep on top of your studies is the second piece of advice. And the third advice is make something of the social opportunities.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
don't spend 100% of your time on your studies.
Yes. That's quite a difficult message to get across to students who are chasing very high marks, and you sort of sometimes those high marks come at the expense of all the other stuff you're talking about there, which seems like a missed opportunity. Yeah,
I think so. I think people change a lot between the beginning and end of university.
yeah, yeah.
Probably the maximum rate of change time in your life, right? And it's typically your first time away from your parents' home. So you're in a new environment. You can be something different from what you were before, and you can find things that interest you.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's good if at least one of those is outside your main study focus.
Okay, so to close off then, so Acorn risk machines became advanced risk machines in 1990, I think, and ARM went public on the London Stock Exchange in 1998. It was bought by SoftBank in 2016 and then refloated again on the New York Stock Exchange last month. So it's arguably the most globally influential British technology company that I can think of, and many other people have made the same argument. So what's your take on where ARM is now? How do you feel about ARM listing? And there was a bit of commentary on why did ARM list in New York rather than London, so it doesn't feel like a very British company anymore. What's your take on this as somebody who's been involved in it right from the very beginning?
Well, of course, yes, Acorn didn't become ARM; it begat ARM.
Yes, yeah.
It's a joint venture with Apple and VLSI Technology, and that happened just after I come to Manchester. So I've always observed ARM from the outside, effectively. Yeah. I felt, although I know the rationale behind the sale to SoftBank, I don't think it was a good move. I mean, ARM's business is very much based on their independence, and they're the kind of Switzerland of the technology world, and so being owned by a company with interests such as SoftBank, even though SoftBank is not directly competing with ARM's other customers, struck me as a bad idea, and it's been pretty clear since the sale to SoftBank that SoftBank don't really know what to do with them.
Yeah.
They promised the British government that they would expand a lot in the direction of IoT, and that didn't work out very well. And then, of course, SoftBank tried to sell them to NVIDIA, which would have been an even worse idea, right? Because NVIDIA is a direct competitor to some of ARM's other customers. So that struck me as a very bad idea. I'm not sure it really matters which stock exchange they floated on. It's still clear that ARM's centre of gravity is in the UK. If you look at their sort of 5,000 or 6,000 employees, more than half of them are UK based.
Yeah, yeah.
Although the management is kind of appears to have slipped over to the States.
Rene Haas, is it? I think.
Yeah, Rene Haas is over there, and of course, the last CEO before that, Simon Sagers, who is a Manchester alumni. He did a master's.
Former student of yours, didn't he? Yeah.
Yes. He had moved to California when ARM took over the physical IP business, whose name I know perfectly well, but it's temporarily slipped my mind. He moved over to kind of integrate them with ARM and stayed there. So as CEO, he was still based in the US. But and in preparation for this IPO, they've parted ways with a whole lot of experienced staff, in particularly in the R&D department. They've restructured the company in ways that I don't claim to understand.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure I have particular insights. I'm not a great business entrepreneur. I'm a technologist, so
Yeah. Okay. Right,
I
fair
don't
enough.
really know how to comment on how they make their business moves, but certainly independence is central to their existence, in my view.
Yeah. Okay. I think that you've already answered my next question, which is where do students? So Acorn Computers played a big role in your career, early opportunities for you. So where do students go to find their Acorn computer in them? I think you've already said that algorithm of go in a direction that leaves the most doors open is a good one. But where do you, as somebody who advises students on their careers, where do they look for those sorts of opportunities that you've had at the early stages of your career?
I think it depends where their interests lie. So ARM is still recruiting. If your interest is in designing silicon chips or lower level companies such as ARM are a fine place to develop that line of career. There are others similarly placed. If you're more operating at the software level, then of course these days there's a very strong emphasis on AI as an area to go into, and lots of opportunities to work in AI. Again, I'm not sure most of the big companies are recruiting in that space.
Yes, yeah.
For anybody who's got any credible skills in AI, the world's wide open, I think, at the moment.
Yes.
But there are also niches. I mean, in the automotive industry, an ever-increasing proportion of a car's sale value is electronics, right? It's
Yeah.
and somebody is many people are in there designing all those systems, and there's lots of interesting stuff to do there. Likewise,
More of a computer on wheels than a car these days. Modern cars feel more like a computer than they would have felt even 10, 20 years ago. So
oh yes. I mean, they are computers on wheels, and often they're not terribly good computers on wheels, right? So the
okay.
quality of operating system and user interface you get in
Yeah.
cars
Awful.
lags behind what you're used to, in smartphones and tablets. And
Yeah. So one last thing on chip design then. So you spent your career in chip design, and just R&D in that space is obviously it's quite hard. I think it's quite a hard thing to do in an academic setting, in the same way as perhaps AI research is quite hard to do in an academic setting because it's very dominated by big commercial laboratories. People like ARM and NVIDIA, for example, in chips. But there's equivalents in AI as well. So, what if for students who are interested in chip design as an academic career, what would you recommend as promising avenues for students in that space where you've spent your career?
yeah, I think it is difficult doing anything close to state-of-the-art chip design because the costs of getting it made are so high.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges in the Spinnaker project was working out at what point we switched from fabricating on a multi-project wafer where you share the cost with a lot of others, but you can only make small quantities, to a production mask, right? And this was basically on Spinnaker, this was about a £125,000 gamble. So whether we went straight to a production wafer or whether we spent that kind of money on another multi-project wafer run.
Yeah.
And fortunately, we got away with it. But and that's now a very old process. So the Spinnaker 2, the costs of making a Spinnaker 2 chip started about €2 million, right? It's just to get the tooling made.
Yeah.
So it's become very difficult, and you can't get the hundreds of man years of design resource in academia. So I think you have to find some way to finesse the problem, and you can do a lot with simulation. But then if you want to see your ideas translated onto silicon, you have to find a company that wants what you've designed and is prepared to pay the money to implement it.
Yeah.
So you need to work more closely with industry, I think, than typically I have done in the course of my career. Yes, it's tricky. Yeah, it's. I mean, the one thing that is available to academics and is very useful is FPGA technology. It's what we use for teaching logic design in our labs, and you can get FPGAs with formidable capabilities. So you can effectively prototype almost anything in hardware on an FPGA at relatively low cost.
Right. Okay.
Prove it out. Now it's not quite the same as full custom silicon, but it's pretty close.
Yeah. Okay, good. So I feel like I've kept you long enough. So thank you for coming on and answering my questions. Just one last question is you retired last on Friday, and we're having a fight shrift, is it? Festschrift on the 12th of January. So we'll look forward to that. But how are you? I know you mentioned you're still trying to work this out. How are you planning to spend your retirement? You mentioned spending more time with your family, being closer to children and grandchildren. What else do you have planned?
Well, I still have a number of connections with companies that will carry on. I'm still involved in the process of trying to commercialize Spinnaker through the university and through Dresden. That's occupying quite a lot of time. But as for what my real retirement plans are, I'm not sure yet. I've still got to contend with the Human Brain Project final review in November, which, despite being retired, I will be basically representing the university at that.
Right.
And typical day yesterday, I still got 3 emails from HR about research staff whose contracts are coming to an end, and
right.
a dozen timesheets, sets of timesheets to sign, and things like this. So my university job hasn't actually gone away yet.
Right. Okay. Well, I hope you enjoy what time, the retirement, that you do take some time to do things that perhaps you're not able to do as a professor. Now you're an emeritus professor, and thanks again for your time. And we look forward to seeing you on if not before, on the 12th of January. I'll put a link to Gavin Brown's organising this Furby Fest, as he called it. I didn't realise it was called that.
Oh dear. Yes,
so
that's what he's calling it, is he? Okay.
Working title. So we look forward to seeing you at that, and enjoy your retirement.
Okay. Thank you, Duncan. I'll do my best.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Hearing Your Future, the Coding Your Future podcast. You can find out more about this episode and all the other episodes, including full transcripts and show notes, at cdyf.me. That's Charlie Delta Yankee Foxtrot Mike Echo. You can also find us on all the major podcast platforms by searching for Coding Your Future. Subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. I hope you found something useful to help you start coding your future today.